Hey everybody, welcome to this very short, I hope, explainer video of the New York State Low Embodied Carbon Concrete Leadership Act. This is a bill that is just about to be introduced at the time of this recording in the New York State Assembly. And it is also the first bill that the OpenAir Collective will be actively advocating for. Going to give you a quick overview in this video. First, just very quickly, why does concrete even matter to climate, since this bill is focused on concrete? What does low embodied carbon concrete even mean? You saw that was right in the title of the bill. What types of policies does this bill actually sort of bring together and would introduce? And then take a little bit of a deeper dive into how those policies actually would work in practice based on how the bill is written. And then I'm going to quickly allude to in that, why is this even relevant to direct air carbon capture, which the OpenAir Collective is focused directly on advancing. So I'll just quickly make that clear. And then I'm going to end with just some summaries of the, just a kind of a summary of the key strengths of the bill. So let's get right into it. First things first, concrete and climate. Why does it matter? Well, first, concrete is the second most used substance on Earth after water. So there's a ton of it. And that's key to its relevance here. And we keep using more of it. In fact, between now and 2050, it's estimated that we're going to build the equivalent of about one New York City a month in terms of global construction, and that is going to involve an enormous amount of concrete and Portland cement, which is actually the main ingredient, kind of the glue of concrete. And we produce about 4 billion tons of that a year, and this is continually increasing. According to the International Energy Agency, we may have up to a 23% increase in Portland cement by 2050. Why does that matter? Because Portland cement, or cement production, is one of the most carbon intensive processes on the planet. Produce about a ton of carbon for every ton of material that's produced, and it's responsible for up to 8% of global carbon emissions. Now, the good news is that there's actually really large opportunities to significantly reduce the carbon footprint or carbon emissions of concrete, particularly that cement component, which is really at the center of its carbon footprint. And even, which is incredibly exciting for us, there's even the potential for concrete to be a net carbon sink. That means that it actually would remove more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere compared to what it emits. And that would be an enormous victory for humanity and for the climate. And obviously, that is really at the center of what the OpenAir Collective is all about, carbon removal. And that really explains our engagement with this legislation. Now, what do we mean by low carbon embodied carbon concrete, which again is right there in the title? Let me explain what that means. Okay. Embodied carbon, unlike the sort of what sometimes is called the operational carbon. A lot of times when we think about carbon emissions, we think about how much carbon is that thing going to use, that car, that building, that plane, etc. Embodied carbon actually is a measurement of how much carbon was emitted in the making of that thing. And that's really what's significant when we are talking about concrete. And that means the production, particularly of cement, which again is the huge sort of outsized part of the carbon footprint of concrete, the transportation, a lot of cement is actually imported from other places that goes into concrete ultimately locally. And then the utilization, the actual laying of concrete has some carbon output anyway. So you take all those things together, and that means it's embodied carbon. How much is carbon was used in the making of that thing? And again, cement is the sort of outsized, like huge part of that, like the actual cement production, that main ingredient. Now, how do we get from ordinary concrete to low embodied concrete? What are the methods of doing that? As you might guess, use less Portland cement. We already probably use too much cement in concrete anyway, but you can also substitute Portland cement, other ingredients for it. Use waste less energy at the facilities where you're making cement and concrete, and use waste less material. A lot of the material that's produced, particularly in the cement phase, is just wasted. So you're expending a lot of carbon for no reason. So just reduction in energy, change in energy use, and more efficient use of materials would reduce the carbon, embodied carbon. And then the other one, which we're really excited about, is to really use more carbon in the actual concrete and in the actual concrete itself. And by that, we're talking about what's often called CCU, or carbon capture and utilization, where you're taking carbon that would have gone to the atmosphere, is in the atmosphere, and you're actually putting it in the thing itself. And that is what makes it of great interest, again, to OpenAir. Now, how do you actually do that in the case of concrete? How are you capturing and utilizing carbon? One thing is with aggregate. Aggregate is like kind of the gravelly type of thing that you mix with cement to make concrete. you can actually make aggregate out of a process with carbon, pulling carbon from industrial sources or from the air, and then mixing that in with cement to make the carbon. So aggregate is one way. And then the other is you can actually inject carbon dioxide right into during the carbon curing process, and that makes it stronger. So both aggregate and injection are two ways of utilizing and storing or mineralizing carbon in concrete. Okay, now back to the bill. The New York State Low Embodied Concrete Act. There's a lot of different ways in which governments can actually support new technologies. We can obviously put money into research and development to improve that technology. You can offer incentives to both producers and consumers so that they will both produce and consume that technology. You can all kinds of different ways that you can fiddle with regulations to make it possible for the technology to come to market, or even prevent some of its competitors from having advantages in the market. And then there's procurement. So the state of New York, buys a lot of things, including concrete. So with procurement-based policies, you're basically leveraging the state's purchasing power, its procurement power, in order to become basically an early adopter of certain key technologies, and that can start to shift the market in general. It can be the first sort of initial sort of shot in the arm for a product, and then the private sector will follow. And this bill is, by and large, a procurement-centered type of bill, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And then it also adds an incentive onto it as well in the form of a tax credit for concrete producers, which again, I'll explain in just a few minutes. Now, what is the bill going to do? At the core of it, it's actually going to make embodied carbon totally relevant to the state's purchasing decisions for concrete, right? So now embodied carbon, like along with everything else that you look at when you decide to buy concrete, is going to be a factor. In fact, it's going to be a determining factor in the state's procurement policy or approach for concrete. And then we're also, as I just said, we're going to add another little tax credit in order to sort of offset some of the costs that concrete makers would have to bear in order to participate in concrete procurement. Okay, key thing to know about this bill, just moving forward, is it's primarily what you'd call sort of more of an incentive or a carrot-based policy than a stick. It's not forcing concrete makers to do a particular thing, but it's kind of creating a set of circumstances that would make it more advantageous for them to actually go ahead and produce green or low carbon concrete. Okay. How would it work? Okay, so when the state actually is accepting bids for concrete purchases, the Office of General Services, which sort of manages procurement for the state, will be required to, again, look at what's the embodied carbon content of the concrete mixes that are being proposed for different infrastructure projects. Okay, the key thing there is, how do they even know, how do they sort of measure or compare the embodied carbon between two different options? This is a really key part that's written right into the bill. There is a methodology for doing this, which are called environmental product declarations, or EPDs. And these are analyses that actually measure the overall environmental performance of a particular thing, including carbon. So again, as before, when we were talking about embodied carbon going into concrete, an EPD would actually do an analysis. It takes a few weeks, I am told, to actually kind of trace back all the different sort of phases of production that have different environmental impacts. Now, again, EPDs measure general environmental performance, but at the center of that are what we call its global warming potential, or GWP number. So an EPD will be able to tell us what is the embodied carbon of a particular mix at a particular concrete plant. Okay, now, bids that have the lowest warming potential, global warming potential number as determined by an EPD are going to be selected in bids if they do a couple of different things. One, obviously the concrete has to be, meet the state's specific structural criteria. It can't be an inferior form of concrete. It has to do the job of concrete really well, according to the state's own requirements. And then it also cannot add to the cost of procurement relative to what the kind of the going market rate for conventional concrete is at the particular time of that procurement process. And then, so how would this actually work in practice here? Okay, so let's just take, for example, 3 different bids that are coming in for a procurement offer here. Bid 1, bid 2, bid 3. Bid 1 is just regular concrete. Let's say it costs $100 per unit. It has a 100 global warming potential number. That's high. Bid 2 is a lower carbon concrete. It has the best performance of the 3. Let's say it produces half of the embodied carbon bid 1, and it costs the same. And then bid 3 is also a good low carbon concrete, but not quite as good as bid 2. In this situation, all things being equal with cost, bid number 2 is going to win. Now, let's say the bid number 2 is actually more expensive than the other 3. Okay, in this case, the winner would be bid 3 because it's lower cost and it has has really good carbon performance as well. Now, if both of these are actually too expensive and priced out, then the winner would be bid 1, the regular concrete. So this is good in terms of obviously for the taxpayer, but it also puts pressure on low carbon concrete producers to continuously lower their pricing. Now, one thing that we're really excited about, which has to do again with that use more carbon or that carbon capture and utilization option, which we're really excited about because we're all about carbon removal, is that we created in here a special incentive for low carbon concretes that actually that are carbon capture and utilization concretes. Okay, how does this work? It's basically kind of like a tie break. Okay, and it gives a little bit more of an allowance on price for these types of mixes. Okay, so concrete mixes that include or bids that include products that capture and utilize or mineralize carbon, they store carbon forever in the concrete, are going to be selected over other bids if, again, they can't have a lower, they have to be, the best or tied with for best for their global warming potential impact numbers. So they have to be the best in that sort of category. And they obviously can't be an inferior mix. They have to be able to demonstrate that they meet all the structural standards of the state. But here they get a little bit of an allowance on price. Okay, so for the first year of the program, carbon capture and utilization mixes, they just can't be more than 15% higher than whatever the going market rate is for regular concrete. That will then go down in year 2 to 10%, and then it'll be 5% kind of indefinitely. So there can be like a 5% premium ultimately for these types of mixes. So this gives a little bit of an advantage without compromising the primary goals of lowering the actual embodied carbon of whatever concrete is selected. So this is an example here where before that $115 per unit concrete, if it's a CCU, again, it takes carbon out of the air or utilizes carbon out of the air and puts it in the carbon. And this, again, is the pathway that we're going to have in order to get to that net negative carbon one day is through these types of mixes. It can be a little bit more expensive and it's going to be selected. Okay. And again, what is it we mean by capture? This is an important part for the OpenAir Collective. There's language right in the bill that specifies carbon capture in these types of mixes can be directly from smokestacks, from industrial sources, or it could be captured directly from the ambient air. That's written right into the bill. Okay. Let me see here. Oh, we already covered that. Again, this is primarily an incentive-based bill. As I just showed, providers don't have to do EPDs, but it's going to give them a better chance of winning. But there's another more explicit type of incentive we've added here is the second part of the bill, and that is this environmental product declaration tax credit for concrete makers. Now, there is a cost to go ahead and getting this EPD analysis at your plant, right? It's not particularly costly, but it's enough to probably maybe get a concrete maker to kind of not do it, right? So what we're going to do here in the beginning is that concrete makers at their different plants can actually claim a tax credit for up to 8 different plants. Some of these companies own multiple plants that will actually cover or offset the cost that they had to bear in order to get that EPD analysis. Again, up to 8 plants. We took that from another state's policy that seems to be working well out in Oregon. And then we also are going to have kind of ramp this down. So for year 1, when the tax credit starts, it's 100% of those EPD costs can be claimed. And then it's going to actually scale down to 0 by year 2023 after 3 years. So this is meant to actually really kind of galvanize concrete makers to take advantage of this right now and start participating, because the opportunity to get that tax credit is going to go away ultimately. Okay, summary of bill's strengths to close. Again, this is what I really like about it. This focuses on a major CO2 source that's really not being addressed by these other, landmark state and, city laws that have been passed in New York in the last year that mostly focus on the electricity sector. So embodied carbon and carbon from concrete have kind of been ignored. So this really sort of adds on to what the spirit of those bills are and creates kind of a new front for us to actually reduce carbon, and that's through concrete in the built environment. This also This adds direct air capture, carbon capture to the bill. It creates this kind of special incentive. It gets it involved in our climate policies here in New York State, but it doesn't do it at the expense of larger goals of reducing carbon through, more kind of conventional means with concrete. So what's good about that is, again, it kind of gets us started. It gets a stake in the ground for direct air capture, but it also it's not going to alienate other potential supporters from the climate advocacy community and beyond, because it fulfills a larger goal. And then the other thing that's really amazing about this is that a lot of times when you have state procurement bills, it's kind of the state that's buying something, and then there's a real lag time, if and even ever it has an effect on the public sector. That sort of early adopter status of the state doesn't always have like a huge or immediate effect. What's amazing about this is that when concrete factories or makers already go ahead, or cement makers as well, which are part of this, when they go ahead and make these changes, it's likely that there's really not much of a reason for them not to just offer it directly to the private sector, particularly since the costs aren't necessarily going to be any higher for the product. So the ripple effect that it could have immediately on the private sector by the state acting could actually be quite substantial and could be quite rapid. So those are the main kind of overview. Hopefully that was clear. Please, if you're interested, the key thing we're going to need to be doing now we need to educate legislators about this. We need to get a Senate sponsor, and we're going to start doing that before the session starts in January 2020. All of this is going to be done in 100% by citizen lobbyists. If you're interested in joining that effort here in New York State, go to our website, theopenaircollective.org, scroll to the bottom and go ahead and enter your contact information, and we'll be in touch and as to how you can sort of lead efforts in your district with your assembly members and your senators. Thank you so much.